Many years ago, when I was a student at the Academy, if someone had suggested that in my 92nd year I might be speaking to a large group of alumni, I would have thought that to be most unlikely. But today that unlikely event has come to be, and I am quite pleased to be here with you, and particularly pleased to accept this fine award from the Alumni Association. Recently, I visited the Academy. I had not been there for some time, and I am always impressed by that beautiful campus, a campus that I think would compare favorably to any day school in this country. And for men, alumni, graduates of my vintage, of my time, there's almost always a sort of comparison, I guess you'd call it, to the old school that was down on Nelson Road. The difference, of course, between those two is like night and day. The school on Nelson Road really never had a campus. Rather, it was like a group of 4 buildings that seemed to be the result of desperation rather than design. But within those old buildings, there was a fine education available to every student, an education that was the work of an outstanding faculty, many of whose names would still be familiar to many of you. Van Sickle, Dennett, Whiting, Evans, Labatt, Goodwin, Buckner, and Hunt. Fine men, every one of them. Dedicated, determined, and loyal. Undoubtedly cut from the same cloth as the faculty of today's Academy. There is, however, one big difference between then and now. That faculty of the old school, down on Nelson Road, back in the 1930s, worked under the difficulties of the worst financial crisis in the history of this country, the Great Depression of the 1930s. Today, it's hard to realize what a depression like that really meant, not only from the standpoint of human misery, but also from the standpoint of goods and services. For instance, a new car, a Ford, nicely equipped as we say today, could be had for well under $500. Gasoline, 13 cents a gallon. Sounds cheap? It was cheap, but we didn't have any money. Frequently, we would gather and contribute our meager income to buy some gas so we could cruise the streets of Bexley. For the faculty, those days meant the need for sacrifice and broad cooperation. Those needs were met and the teaching continued. Our class at the Academy was probably typical of those days, but we did seem to have more than our share of tragedy. During our school years, Sam Stevenson and Junie Rutledge died in separate automobile accidents, and not long after that, World War II took its grim toll. Dick White, a short-time transfer student, died on some godforsaken island in the far western reaches of the Pacific. Jack Farrer, a longtime member of our class, was a pilot, lost in a combat zone, flying over what has been called the trackless wastes of the Pacific Ocean. And George Winger, Fuzzy Winger, a particularly good friend of mine, was also a pilot, shot down in the disastrous low-altitude daylight bombing raid against the Ploesti oil fields of Romania. That raid, that day, is carried in Army Air Corps history as Black Thursday. Those losses were tragic at the time, of course, but nothing could be done to soften the blows that were felt by families and friends. For in spite of those tragic events, my memories of the Academy are filled with good times and with the fun of the challenges that are always part of an Academy education. For many of us, the true value of that education was not realized until long after graduation, when our understanding of the privileges we had enjoyed became clear. Those days at the Academy were a wonderful time in my life, a time that will always hold a special place in my memory. When I met with Steve, to talk about today's program, I mentioned that the many virtues of the Academy had been praised often and in words and ways far better than anything I could offer. And he suggested that perhaps a change of pace might be welcome. I asked him what he meant, and he said, pick an incident in your life that has been particularly memorable or meaningful for you, and tell us about it. Well, that was all right with me, and so be it. The incident that I will tell you about is short. It's not about danger or adventure or anything like that, but it has remained bright and clear in my mind for a very long time. Many years ago, when I was flying, my duties became changed for quite some period of time, and I was in charge of all-weather flight for 2 East Coast jet fighter squadrons, 3 years with a squadron at Willow Grove outside of Philadelphia, followed by 3 years with a squadron at Floyd Bennett Field in New York, across the bay from Kennedy International. If that name, Floyd Bennett Field, strikes a chord in your memory of history, it's probably because that's the field from which Lindbergh took off in 1927 for his famous flight across the Atlantic Ocean. In that capacity, being in charge of all-weather flight for 2 jet fighter squadrons, I was able to do a lot of cross-country flying from one military base to another, frequently in bad weather, sometimes in severely bad weather. It was part of my job. I enjoyed it, and I was very good at it. That's not a boast, that's a requirement. Years ago, Admiral Noel Geiler said, if you're a single-seat fighter pilot with an all-weather commitment, you'd better be very good. For anything less, the consequences can be extreme. His judgment has been proven many times over, and I have always been a firm follower of his philosophy.